Ini agak cepet nanti nggak apa-apa ya, tapi asal kalau kalian mudah merasa suara saya terlalu cepat, kalian boleh boleh angkat tangan gitu. Tapi saya bilang dulu bahwa saya agak cepat supaya materinya dua ini bisa tersalurkan dengan nyaman. Sebentar. Tapi ada rekamannya sih. Cuman tadi kalau ada yang nggak jelas silahkan, silahkan angkat tangan, silahkan potong nggak apa-apa. Nah, jadi dua pertemuan ini adalah tentang arsitektur Roma. Jadi ini pertemuan 11-12 ya, sebentar. 11-12 itu Roma, terus kemudian eh 11-12 Roma, 13, 14, 15, 16 ya, kita empat pertemuan berikutnya itu adalah Mesir dan penyelesaian tugas. Sebentar. Kayaknya saya butuh ini deh, butuh host supaya membantu saya. Ini beberapa saya jadikan co-host. Tolong saya nanti dibantu kalau ada yang masuk dan saya lagi menjelaskan ya. Oke, saya acak nih siapa aja lah tadi pokoknya yang kecantol tak jadikan co-host nanti tolong dibantu kalau saya lagi ngajar nggak lihat. Oke, kita mulai ya. Jadi tadi pertemuan 11-12 ini adalah Roma, kemudian nanti 13 sampai 16 itu kita mulai membahas tentang Mesir. Nah, ini karena agak agak ngegas yang harusnya satu kali jadikan dua. Oke, 11-12 ya. Arsitektur Roma. Jadi, oh ini belum tak Indonesia kan ya. Jadi ini adalah Kolosium di foto itu tahun 1909. Kalian bisa bayangin ya, Indonesia belum jadi apa-apa gitu loh. Kita masih merdeka aja belum, tapi sudah ditemukan kolosium gitu ya, yang seperti ini. Jadi mereka sudah apa ya, sudah bisa membayangkan kebesaran kejayaan masa lalu sejarah mereka. Nah, ini adalah foto kolosium yang diambil tahun 1909 gitu. Terus kemudian ini, jadi di sana tuh ada yang namanya Roman Forum. Roman Forum itu adalah tatanan gitu ya, eh yang tatanan kalian bisa bandingkan kemarin eh kota yang ada di Yunani itu kan isinya apa namanya apa tempel, ada pemerintahan, ada tempel, lebih banyak tempel lah. Tapi yang di sini, yang di Roman Forum, jadi forum itu ya seperti kota begitu. eh Kayak apa ya? Dia nyebutnya sih forum itu kayak kayak wadah, wadah yang paling paling lengkap atau paling utama. Ini salah satu contohnya terletak di lembah antara Palatin dan Capitol Hill. Nah, dia itu ada pusat komersial. Nah, ini yang dulu di Yunani belum ada ya. Kemudian agama dan politik Roma kuno. Nah, kita nontonnya di YouTube aja supaya bisa di lebih besar. Bentar. Terus oh dia nggak ada sisinya ya. Oh jadi berarti dia gambar aja. Nah, sekarang mari kita me mari kita KKL ke Kolosium. Oke, tadi gambaran tentang Roma. Nah, kemudian ini, apa yang jadi ciri khas arsitektur Roma? Jadi kalau kita tadi bisa melihat bahwa yang disebut tempel atau kuil ya samalah ya, mirip samalah dengan Yunani. Jadi yang terutama kalau kita menganalisis bahwa karena Roma itu memiliki wilayah yang besar sehingga eh, masyarakatnya semakin luas sehingga kebutuhan-kebutuhan ruang baru itu mulai ada di Roma dan kemudian eh, kebutuhan-kebutuhan baru itu membutuhkan hal lain selain fungsi gitu ya. Jadi ada filosofi dan sebagainya yang lebih apa ya lebih detail. Ya ya kan dia lagi meneruskan ya. Nah, tadi kan di sini yang menjadi cirinya di luar tradisional Roma yang ditandai tadi ya dengan podium yang setinggi pintu masuk itu, Roma itu dicirikan dengan adopsi perencanaan holistik penggunaan material baru ini yang berani. Jadi konstruksi sudah mapan di zaman Yunani begitu, terus kemudian material-material baru. Eh, itu sangat masuk akal kalau material barunya bertambah karena wilayah yang dia jajah dan kuasai semakin luas, kemudian pilihan materialnya semakin besar, kemudian apa namanya ya tenaga-tenaga ahli, tenaga pekerja yang dia butuhkan juga bisa semakin banyak begitu ya, dan mengarah pada struktur yang luar biasa yang jauh eh, lebih rumit dibanding yang Romawi yang sebelumnya ada. Nah, bagaimana arsitektur Romawi itu berbeda? Nah, kalau orang Yunani itu suka marmer, orang Romawi itu mulai beton. Kalian bisa bayangkan marmer itu apa yang ada di alam, mereka mereka potong gitu ya, mereka olah langsung digunakan alam itu. Nah, itu Yunani. Nah, Roma itu mengolah. Jadi mereka menciptakan beton, mereka mengandalkan bahan bangunan ini. Jadi semakin tidak terbatas ketinggiannya, kebesarannya dan kemegahannya dengan adanya beton ini. Bangsa Roma itu menekankan bentuk-bentuk melingkar kubah. Kenapa? Karena dia sudah tahu caranya mengolah beton gitu ya. Kubah tidak seperti dia udah nggak, kalau Yunani kan masih pakai tiang dan sebagainya. Kenapa? Karena umumnya mereka menggunakan batu-batu yang kokoh itu ya, granit langsung digunakan. Tapi dengan adanya eh, apa kemampuan orang bangsa Roma untuk menciptakan beton, mereka menjadi tidak terbatas lagi gitu ya, karena mereka bisa bikin betonnya sehingga lengkungan dan ketinggian itu bisa melebihi. Nah, sekarang terus gimana gitu ya? Nah, ini pengaruhnya itu pada desain kubah gitu ya, kemudian pilar-pilar material betonnya gitu ya, kemudian arena olahraga, spa itu konsepnya dari Yunani. Nah, kemudian kok Yunani Romawi, sorry. Antara yang diucapkan yang dan yang dipikirkan berbeda. Nah, ini seni dan arsitektur Romawi. Bangsa Romawi itu awalnya dari Italia Tengah, kemudian dipengaruhi oleh budaya lokal Itali. Ini namanya Etrurian, sebelum dia dipengaruhi oleh Yunani ya. Abad kelima mulai berhubungan dengan Yunani, kemudian Romawi mulai menyerap aspek klasik, kemudian tapi seperti yang kalian nanti akan olah, kalian nanti akan menemukan bahwa meskipun dia sudah dikuasai dengan Yunani, namun dia tidak kehilangan identitasnya begitu ya. Lukisan, foto-foto dan relief. Ekspansi ya, perluasan kekuasaan Romawi itu kemudian kan yang apa namanya? Yang aktif tuh Romawi ya untuk mengalahkan Yunani dan sebagainya itu dia sehingga dia berbaur juga dengan Yunani, namun pada perkembangannya dia berbaur dengan banyak banyak kebudayaan begitu ya. Dia membentang ini tuh wilayahnya membentang dari Britania Raya sampai ke Sahara, sampai Spanyol, sampai ke Arab. Konon peta kekuasaannya itu. Ya, Mesir udah kena kan. Nah, ini penjelasan mengenai Roma yang lebih eh, lebih global begitu ya. Sebentar. Tak, tak, tak.
For maps of the city and used it as a reference for.
Ada-
In 1748, architect Giambattista Nolli made this map of Rome. It was so accurate that by the 1970s, the Italian government still relied on it as the basis for maps of the city and used it as a reference for urban planning. Rome is roughly divided into three main sections. The ancient part of Rome, where you'll find the Roman Forum, the Colosseum, and other ancient sites like the Circus Maximus and the Baths of Caracalla. Then there's the Renaissance and Baroque part of Rome. This is where the most famous buildings and piazzas are located, including the Vatican City and St. Peter's Square on the other side of the river. And then there's this place called Trastevere, which means at the other side of the Tiber, which is the name of the river. And here you will find a lot of palaces and villas from the Renaissance period. We're going to focus on this part of the city, because thanks to Renaissance and Baroque artists and architects, these public spaces became not only a focus for tourists and artists, but also a watershed of inspiration throughout the Western world. Everything is within a walking distance, and you will find the most wonderful buildings, fountains, and streets that make walking in Rome a more fascinating experience than walking in pretty much any other city in the world. This entire city is like a museum filled with architectural masterpieces. If you think about the Renaissance, architects in Italy had this one general thought: we want to be like the Romans. But they were thinking about that from an intellectual point of view. They were looking at the forms of the Romans: domes, pyramids, columns, round arches, geometry, symmetry. But they weren't so much looking at the infrastructural technology of the Romans. And in 1585, Sixtus V gets elected as Pope, and he picks up this other aspect of what it is to be a Roman. And he becomes very interested in infrastructure, building roads, building bridges, building aqueducts. The final form of Renaissance Rome owes most to the pontificate of Sixtus V. He was in the papacy for only 5 years. It was a relatively short period of time. But during that time, he undertook all of these projects to modernize Rome. Medieval Rome was a mess. Although it was home to major centers of religious pilgrimage, the city's haphazard street system impeded circulation and diminished spectators' vantage on its monuments. Also, the city was sacked by invading armies several times, and it had been sacked in 1527. So a lot of the roads and aqueducts weren't working since Roman antiquity in the imperial period. When Sixtus V assumed the papacy, only one ancient Roman aqueduct was still in service, delivering fresh water. It was the Aqua Virgo, and it was bringing in water near the area where we now have the Trevi Fountain. But water was needed in many other parts of the city. So the Pope had a competent architect, Domenico Fontana, to whom he gave the task of restoring the ancient aqueduct of Alexandrina and bringing water in to other parts of Rome. So this fountain, called Aqua Felice, might simply look like another piece of pompous and grandiose Baroque architecture, but it is much more than that. Aqua Felice is the head of the ancient aqueduct of Alexandrina that was restored by him to bring fresh water into 27 new fountains situated across Rome. Quite an accomplishment. With the restoration of the ancient aqueducts, more fountains could be made functioning in the city of Rome and more people could have fresh water. Sixtus V also drained marshes that had been places for malaria mosquitoes to breed, and he re-established some roads and bridges that had been broken and that had fallen into disrepair. This outline represents the Aurelian Wall, built by Aurelian, the Roman emperor in the 3rd century. So in the ancient times of Rome, Rome was this big, and in the Renaissance and Baroque time, Rome was about this big. This is a big disappointment if you happen to be the Pope. And so what Sixtus V wanted to do was make Rome better, and he undertook this big project of urbanism. The main program of works made by Sixtus consisted in connecting key points in the city. Rome was a great pilgrimage city, so he opened several wide-long principal streets that provided a link between the 7 pilgrimage churches of Rome: St. Peter's, San Giovanni in Laterano, Santa Maria Maggiore, San Paolo fuori le mura, and San Lorenzo fuori le mura. The original 5 churches, and 2 accorded special veneration later, Santa Croce in Gerusalemme and San Sebastiano. These realized the ambition to make Rome a worthy capital of Christendom. Sixtus V was not, however, concerned only to facilitate religious ceremonial. He was well aware of the role that new streets could play in generating growth in the largely uninhabited districts. So he got built a series of fake roads with fake facades, these incredibly thin walls that you can observe in the Noli plan, which in reality had agricultural land behind, with farm animals like cows and chickens, and the ambition with these fake facades was to define the street edge no matter what happens behind the street edge. The city today is completely urbanized, but traces of these fake facades can still be seen in the gardens of the Palazzo Quirinale, or along this street going toward the Porta Pia, where these Baroque churches appear to respect the continuity of the wall, but at the same time get identified as a monument within the city. And if you look at them from the side, you see no church. You see how completely autonomous the facade is from the actual church that's behind. This diagram of Rome leaves so much out that it shows you what the big idea is. We have the main gates to the city, the Piazza del Popolo and the Porta Pia, establishing these major axes. Porta Pia goes straight to the Palazzo Quirinale, which is the Pope's summer palace, and then we have the Trident, these 3 roads coming off of Piazza del Popolo. The first one was originally planned to link the isolated Santa Croce in Gerusalemme directly to the Piazza del Popolo, some 4 kilometers distant by the way of Santa Maria Maggiore. But the architect was forced to terminate the street in front of the church of Santa Trinità dei Monti because of the steep slopes of the hill. But thanks to that, a magnificent flight of steps, scalinata, was built down the hillside to the Piazza di Spagna. And from there, the street would continue all the way to Piazza del Popolo. Aware of his own limited time, Sixtus V devised a unique method of ensuring that his successors would be obliged to continue to implement his program of connecting the main points of Rome. He placed obelisks at points where, during the coming centuries, the most important squares would develop. In the future Piazza del Popolo, at the intersection of the 3 routes, at Santa Maria Maggiore, in front of San Giovanni in Laterano, and most significantly, in terms of its subsequent effect, in front of the still unfinished St. Peter's. Urban design really doesn't have to do everything at one moment. Actually, the best thing that can happen in terms of urban design is to set a plan in motion and allow history to fill it in. So more obelisks were added by later popes at other intersections of the street system, like the one at the top of the Scalinata, the one at Piazza del Quirinale, in front of the Pantheon, and at Piazza Navona. And what's so amazing is that every single street in Rome is terminated by a visual ending point, whether it's an obelisk, the facade of a church, or the facade of an interesting building. And if you're moving through the city, you know where you're going because every obelisk is visible from the next. It's a big city, it's a tangled city. But we're moving with direction and with understanding about how the city works because of these interventions placed there by Sixtus V. The middle street of the Trident shoots straight to Piazza Venezia and to the Vittorio Emanuele II monument, a national monument from the 20th century. Behind this is the Campidoglio, the Capitoline. The Capitoline is the hill where the Temple of Jupiter was located in Roman antiquity. Since the beginning of Rome, it has always been the place where power was centralized, the most important hill among the 7 hills in Rome. Throughout the Middle Ages and continuing into the Renaissance, it became the seat of secular government, basically the town hall. In the medieval period, however, the capital was just as disorderly as so many other places in Rome. The famous hill had been plowed up by horsemen, and bushes grew at random over the uneven terrain. In 1537, Michelangelo got commissioned a project for a monumental square on the site. Michelangelo is arguably the most gifted of the many versatile architects of the Italian Renaissance. As a focal point of his plan for the capital, the bronze statue of Marcus Aurelius, the only surviving equestrial statue of ancient Rome, was erected on a pedestal. The piazza was not a completely enclosed space. The three buildings form a trapezoid with the fourth side open along the edge of the hill, up which the monumental approach flight of steps has been cut, slightly wider at the top than at the bottom. It is a small space, 55 meters across at its widest and 41 meters at its narrowest, between the flanking buildings. This effect of false perspective forced on Michelangelo by the existing alignments accentuates the importance of the Palazzo del Senatore. The unity and coherence of the design were achieved thanks to the shape of the oval and its two-dimensional star-shaped pattern. Immediately below the Capitoline stretches out the Roman Forum, and immediately in front of it in the other direction, you have the extent of Rome moving towards St. Peter's. So not simply does the secular seat of power conceptually draw a line between the two Romes, the Renaissance Rome of the Vatican and the pagan Rome of classical antiquity, but it does so physically as well. And the third street from the Trident would have met at this point called Porto di Ripetta. It was a river port that was demolished in the early 1900s because the river would flood all the time. So they put a big flood wall there. And it's really tragic because the relationship of Rome to its river is really awful now. And once there would have been this kind of wonderful Baroque opening up into the river. But you can still see it in the Noli map and in some old photographs. I mentioned how Sixtus's plan is established by these two major axes, and at some point these axes intersect. And the way Sixtus's architect, Domenico Fontana, marked this special moment within the plan was to chamfer all the corners at 45 degrees and stick a fountain in each corner. Hence the name of that intersection, Le Quattro Fontane, the Four Fountains. And at this juncture, we also have this little church stuck at the corner by one of my favorite architects, Francesco Borromini. Probably one of the most beautiful churches in Rome. Here you can see a mapping of all the obelisks and all the streets that Sixtus put to connect the important sites of Rome. If we see the way they all hang together, these early Christian churches form a cross, and they come together in the Colosseum. So the Colosseum itself becomes a point of interest, and there was a project to put a church inside the Colosseum. And that becomes interesting because even though it never got built, the idea of an ovalized courtyard, already suggested here by the appropriation of the Colosseum, is something that other people begin to operate on. Bernini puts a giant ovalized courtyard in the Vatican with obelisk in the middle, and Valadier puts a giant ovalized courtyard at Piazza del Popolo with obelisk in the middle. Piazza del Popolo was the main entrance place to the city even since Roman times, and you can see here that two twin-domed churches were built in the angles formed by the three streets. And this trapezoidal piazza that existed during Sixtus's time got rebuilt much later to the ovalized space that we have today. Again, subsequent generations fleshing out the implications of the early work. The Escalinata, or the Spanish Steps, were as well built later, between 1721 to 1725, and they are the only example in the history of city planning where a staircase does not merely lead to a square in front of a monumental structure that is a church, but where the stairs themselves become the visual and spatial center. Before they got built, you had to go up these smaller stairs in the back, but what happens here in the Spanish Steps is an example of this theatricality or the tendency of the city to be seen as a stage set in the Baroque period. You have a series of extending landings that become like stages, and the rhythm is strange because it stretches and it contracts over and over again, and you're constantly experiencing different things. It's about moments like these, which redirect your view to other parts of the city, and you're proceeding on this very shallow incline, so that you appreciate the materiality of the stone and the changing aspects of this topographically complex city. And also when you get to the top, you see Rome in a different way. You don't see the bases of churches, you see the domes of churches. and the city becomes almost like a field with ideal pavilions in it, just a dome floating up there. They're called the Spanish Steps because in the 17th century, the Spanish embassy was located at the base of the stairs. The houses, palaces, and churches of the Piazza Navona follow precisely the layout of the Roman circus built by the Roman Emperor Domitian in the 1st century AD. Indeed, the well-preserved ruins of the seats and corridors are incorporated into the piazza's foundations. You can see that the plan of the piazza has the same shape as the plan of a Roman circus. The final spatial organization of the piazza was carried out by Bernini in the 17th century. The long and narrow form of the space meant that all views had to be designed as oblique perspectives. The piazza contains 3 richly modeled fountains, whose cascading waters are enhanced by the surrounding houses and the 2 churches of San Giacomo degli Spagnoli and Sant'Agnese. There are more fountains in Rome than in any other city in the world. And this is the greatest of all the fountains in Rome, La Fontana di Trevi, the Trevi Fountain. The original design was by Bernini, and it was eventually stopped at the death of the Pope that commissioned it, and it was finished in the 18th century by Nicola Salvi. It's a great idea to make a fountain that's part of the city, and he does it by attaching the fountain to the facade of a building. So the very concept of the fountain is building that collapses into rustication. Rustication in architecture means to give the rock a deliberately rough surface. So the marble of the Trevi Fountain looks like the living rock, and then water squirts out of the building, and you've got these wild horses inside, and these heroic classical figures all over the place. But essentially what is going on in the Trevi Fountain is, it gets its power by making this direct confrontation between a natural condition and a cultural condition. You begin to see how architecture simply cannot hold its own in a world where nature is so powerful, and the architecture begins to dissolve into nature. And this is something that Bernini has done in other places. For example, we saw the Fountain of the Four Rivers in Piazza Navona, where he's very interested in hyper-rustication, or in finding a way that things carved by man become like nature. The great church of St. Peter's was built between 1506 and 1626, but it lacked an appropriate entrance forecourt until 1655, when Bernini carried out the 2 major sections of a 3-part piazza complex. These spaces are the Piazzaretta directly in front of the church, and the vast Piazza Obliqua enclosed by the semicircular colonnades. The 3rd section, the Piazza Rusticucci, has never been finally completed and is represented only in part by Mussolini's avenue linking St. Peter's with the Tiber River. In preparing his layout, which was successful in completion with his leading contemporaries, Bernini had to incorporate the central obelisk erected in 1586 by Sixtus V and the 2 fountains built by Maderno in 1613. The scale of both the church and the spaces is vast. The Piazzaretta in front of the eastern elevation is 125 meters wide, narrowing to 91 meters where it adjoins the Piazza Obliqua, and 98 meters deep. The Piazza Obliqua itself is not a true ellipse, but consists of 2 semicircles of radius of approximately 79 meters, with a rectangle in between giving a total width of 198 meters. Sixtus's plan was so successful that a very similar plan was executed in Paris about 300 years later, where many wide long streets were opened through the messy medieval layout of the city to connect important moments within the city. And it has since continued to influence other cities in the world, many of which have been planned using this same scheme.
Ya, itu gambaran utuh.
You can find a lot more of Rome.
Gambaran utuh mengenai Roma. Sekarang kita pelajari. Nah, ini rumah. Setelah rumah, nanti kita masuk ke resum 10 hal utama yang menjadi poin-poin kunci di dalam arsitektur Roma, dan itu seperti apa ya? Seperti mengkonklus, mengkristalkan gitu. Tapi ini kita lihat dulu di mana para arsitek Roma sudah berpikir mengenai bagaimana menampung, memberikan ruang tinggal bagi warga masyarakatnya. Langsung orang asing. Duh.
The Romans lived in a wide variety of homes, depending on whether they were wealthy or poor. The poor lived in cramped apartments in the cities or in small shacks in the country. The rich lived in private homes in the city or large villas in the country. Most people in the cities of ancient Rome lived in apartments called insulae. The wealthy lived in single-family homes called domus of various sizes depending on how rich they were. The vast majority of people living in the Roman cities lived in cramped apartment buildings called insulae. Insulae were generally 3 to 5 stories high and housed from 30 to 50 people. The individual apartments usually consisted of 2 small rooms. The bottom floor of the insulae often housed shops and stores that opened out to the streets. The larger apartments were also near the bottom, with the smallest at the top. Many insulae were not constructed very well. They could be dangerous places if they caught fire and sometimes even collapsed. The wealthy elite lived in large single-family homes called domus. These homes were much nicer than the insulae. Most Roman houses had similar features and rooms. There was an entryway that led to the main area of the house called the atrium. Other rooms such as bedrooms, dining room, and kitchen might be off to the sides of the atrium. Beyond the atrium was the office. In the back of the home was often an open garden. While the poor and the slaves lived in small shacks or cottages in the countryside, the wealthy lived in large, expansive homes called villas. The Roman villa of a wealthy Roman family was often much larger and more comfortable than their city home. They had multiple rooms including servants' quarters, courtyards, baths, pools, storage rooms, exercise rooms, and gardens. They also had modern comforts such as indoor plumbing and heated floors. The word insulae means islands in Latin. The entrance to a Roman house was called the ostium. It included the door and the doorway. Fine Roman homes were built with stone, plaster, and brick. They had tiled roofs. A villa urbana was a villa that was fairly close to Rome and could be visited often. A villa rustica was a villa that was a far distance from Rome and was only visited seasonally. Wealthy Romans decorated their homes with murals, paintings, sculptures, and tile mosaics.
Yes. Oke ya. Nah, sekarang kita bicara tentang inovasi materialnya. Ini tadi, oh sudah, itu kok ada diulang ya? Ya, tadi kita mengenal bahwa apa namanya, selain kalau yang Yunani itu menggunakan material granit gitu ya, kalau Romawi itu dengan batu bata dan beton, terutama beton, karena dengan beton mereka bisa membuat kubah-kubah gitu ya, kemudian kolom-kolom yang eh, tingginya jauh melebihi kebiasaan. Nah, ini aspek kunci. Ini yang dimaksud adalah bahwa kekaisaran, patung-patung, dan tadi kita melihatkan bahwa patung-patung itu digunakan untuk, jadi karena dia itu adalah negara yang penakluk gitu ya, memperbesar wilayahnya dengan menaklukkan dan dia berhasil, eh, itu semua dijadikan apa ya, bukti bahwa ada gerbang-gerbang yang cukup besar itu adalah tempat di mana mereka bisa mulai menaklukkan. Jadi kalau mereka masuk dan menaklukkan sebuah wilayah, terus kemudian mereka membuat gerbang. Nah, kemudian kalau tadi kita lihat lagi bahwa orang-orang penting yang berkuasa di sana itu dibuat patung-patung dan sebagainya. Jadi itu betul-betul apa namanya ya, betul-betul menunjukkan bahwa ini adalah wilayah kekuasaan kaisar tertentu gitu ya. Namun demikian, tadi selain selain karya-karya yang menunjukkan kekuasaan politiknya, tadi kita sudah melihat bahwa ada bentuk perencanaan rumah-rumah tinggal. Jadi kayak real estate property itu sudah ada di zaman Roma. Tadi kan ada tipe mewah, tipe sedang, dan tipe kayak 136 itu ya, 6 itu yang untuk orang-orang miskin. Tadi kita sudah lihat contoh-contohnya. Dan kemudian bangunan-bangunan publik, kemudian di situ sudah ada pemandian, teater, gitu ya, memberikan nuansa budaya. Terus kemudian lengkungan-lengkungan tadi kubah, kolom-kolom. Eh, Nah, kemudian tadi kita lihat bahwa bagaimana mereka mulai menciptakan kolom-kolom yang ditata lengkung dan sebagainya itu untuk memberi kekuatan visi pandangan. Tadi dicontohkan di dalam film bahwa tangga yang ada di tengah kota pun itu diberi ujung kita menghadap ke sebuah bangunan yang lebih tinggi. Jadi bagaimana konsep mengarahkan pandangan pada sebuah kota itu sudah mulai dilakukan. Skala ini, oke. Kita langsung ke. Nah, ini 5 cara arsitektur Romawi itu mengubah peradaban. Ya, arsitektur Romawi itu tadi kita udah ngelihat kan, dari mulai kalian melihat keseluruhan kotanya secara animasi, kemudian keseluruhan kotanya yang sekarang yang setelah dibangun gitu ya, yang setelah di apa namanya dikonservasi. Nah, kita semua sepakat ya bahwa arsitektur Romawi itu memang revolusioner gitu ya. Dia dia merubah di zaman itu ya, dia sudah merubah banyak hal, terutama tadi mekanika yang sudah dimiliki oleh bangsa Yunani, kemudian disempurnakan dengan eh, konsep-konsep sebuah konsep perancangan yang bagaimana mengatur kolom sehingga menjadi pemusatan dan sebagainya. Kemudian tadi kita lihat ya, mereka sudah bicara tentang poros, kemudian menghubungkan, kemudian tadi ada cerita wilayah-wilayah yang kosong yang tidak berpenghuni itu dibikin jalan palsu dan dibikin dinding palsu, kemudian itu digunakan untuk tanah apa pertanian dan sebagainya gitu ya. Jadi eh namanya tanah kosong untuk pertanian itu nggak dibiarin alamiah gitu, tetap tetap ditata untuk apa? Untuk memperindah eh, visual pemandangan, gaya dan bahkan landmark yang masih berdiri hingga saat ini. Pengaruhnya hampir banyak. Nah, ini ada beberapa aspek kunci. Nah, ini 5 hal yang tadi ya, ini 5 hal yang apa ya, yang dia mampu mengubah peradaban itu satu. Dia membangun monumen sebagai pernyataan kekuasaannya. Seperti tadi saya ceritakan tadi bahwa mereka itu menunjukkan bahwa ini sudah menjadi gerbang penaklukan saya itu dengan membangun banyak gerbang-gerbang. Jadi kalau kalian perhatikan di Paris itu ada Arch de Triomphe itu penaklukannya Roma terhadap Paris pada Prancis gitu ya. Ini menyatakan kekuatan Romawi karena para kaisar merayakan statusnya dengan karya-karya eh, monumenta ini nih. Ini Ars Constantine adalah ini di London. Nanti di London ada Ars Constantine, di Paris ada Arts de Triomphe, dan nanti silahkan Anda sambil memilih-milih lagi di seluruh belahan dunia yang pernah menjadi jajahan Romawi gitu. Ya, ini Pantheon di Roma, kubahnya itu masih masih apa ya, masih menjadi teka-teki sampai sekarang bagaimana mungkin mereka bisa membuat kubah beton tanpa penyangga, dan ini terbesar di dunia. Sekarang belum ada lagi yang bisa seperti ini, ditugaskan pada masa pemerintahan ini 27 tahun sebelum Masehi sampai 14 tahun lalu diresmikan pada 126 Masehi. Bangunan ini sekarang umurnya 2000 tahunan ya. Nah, ini Pantheon. Terus kemudian nih yang ketiga, mengembangkan lingkungan kubah dalam arsitektur. Nah, dia mulai eh, meskipun tadinya yang menciptakan apa namanya Yunani, namun demikian dia mengembangkan gitu ya, eh, sehingga dia mampu membuat struktur atap tanpa bergantung pada pilar. Gini. Nah, kemudian ini arsitektur kubah, kemudian yang keempat, loh kok langsung ini? Sebentar. Ya ini. Jadi tadi arsitektur Kubah itu kemudian mereka sudah mulai membangun untuk fasilitas pertumbuhan kota ini adalah saluran air. Jadi kalau ini yang ada di Indonesia itu di Salatiga itu banyak lengkung-lengkung air gini. Jadi itu adalah sebetulnya saluran air memelopori konsep arsitektur yang canggih dengan fasilitas-fasilitas pertumbuhan kota. Dilayani ini abad ketiga ya, dia sudah memberi pelayanan air di 11 saluran air dengan 800 km jalur air. Ini yang keempat tadi ya, jadi dia sudah selain ini dia sudah mulai membuat saluran air, kemudian jembatan. Oke, ini masih terlalu banyak. Jadi kita tonton dulu videonya ini. Dengan adanya saluran air, mereka mulai memikirkan tentang unsur kesehatan di dalam kehidupan masyarakat. Jadi benar-benar Roma ini udah benar-benar modern banget. Jadi eh, mari kita lihat bagaimana dia membuat pemandian umum yang sangat, kalau zaman sekarang itu mungkin namanya eksekutif club. Jadi, tapi ini bisa ribuan orang yang mandi. Tapi apa namanya? Di situ ada enggak cuman kolam tempat mandi, di situ ada tempat olahraga, ada perpustakaan. Kebayang nggak sih? Orang-orang tuh kalau mandi berlama-lama tuh sambil sambil baca gitu ya. Keren banget.
Roman baths. Cleanliness was important to the Romans, and every city had a public bathhouse. Baths were places for the community to gather and wash, socialise, exercise, and relax, quite like a modern leisure centre. Everyone could visit them, including the poor, as the entrance fee was small and sometimes free. The bathhouse was made up of several
Nah, ini
rooms.
daerahnya nih.
After changing in the apoditarium, you entered the tepidarium, the main hall with a warm bath to relax in. You would rub oil on your body here before entering the caldarium, a very hot steam room and bath. The heat made you sweat, and a slave would scrape the dirt off your body with a metal strigil. In the frigidarium, there was a cold bath to cool down in. The palaestra was a gymnasium where young men would exercise. Women would bathe at different times or in different areas. Larger baths had libraries, cafes, and even gardens. There were beautiful buildings with domed ceilings and glass windows, and were decorated with mosaics, marble walls, and statues. The baths used underfloor heating, a hypocaust system. They were built on columns, so hot air from fires could circulate underneath. The walls were heated by clay pipes leading to the chimneys. Some were built on natural hot springs they believed had healing powers, and others had water transported from lakes by aqueducts. By 300 AD, Rome had over 900 baths. The largest was the Baths of Diocletian. It could fit 3,000 people and used a reservoir holding 20,000 cubic meters of water.
Oke. Terus kemudian ini itu tadi salah satu tempat pemandian yang kita sudah ditunjukkan denahnya, konsepnya, lapisan-lapisan aktivitas yang harus dilakukan untuk mendapatkan kesempurnaan mandi gitu ya. Tapi tadi rakyat jelata juga boleh masuk bahkan nggak bayar gitu ya. Eh, ini fasilitas publik. Nah, kemudian ini ada satu lagi yang lebih mewah, yang termewah, yang namanya adalah Karakala. Di Hmm,
Among so many other things, the magnificence of ancient Roman culture and architecture is demonstrated by the baths, or thermae. Roman emperors were eager to build more and more splendid and monumental thermae. The baths of Caracalla were built in the south of Rome in the 3rd century AD. The baths were situated on an area of about 300 meters by 300 meters. Service buildings were connected to the outer walls. There were shops and also a library. Inside the walls there was a garden with promenades. The spa building was enormous. It measured more than 200 meters in width and more than 100 meters in length. The building consisted of several interconnected circular and polygonal halls covered by domes and groin vaults. The baths could hold up to 1,600 visitors at the same time. There were rooms and pools of different temperatures, from cold to hot. Thermae offered varied services such as changing rooms, massage rooms, saunas, and sports areas. The most important rooms in the baths were the frigidarium, with 4 cold pools, the open-air swimming pool, or natatio, and the caldarium, with 7 warm pools. The walls were covered with marble and decorated with mosaics and statues. Water was provided by an underground pipe system through 18 cisterns. Rooms were usually heated with a hypocaust, an underground heating system. The floor was raised above the ground by pillars, and air heated by furnaces circulated in the space between them. Brick walls containing empty spaces inside, or pipes, could also be heated with this method. There were 50 furnaces to ensure continuous heating. The bath complex of Caracalla is one of the best preserved Roman buildings of this kind. It was included on the list of UNESCO World Heritage Cultural Sites in 1980.
Oke. Nah, ini tadi sudah saya jelaskan bahwa eh, yang nomor 4 itu dia sudah mampu membuat saluran air yang panjangnya sampai 800 km. Itu sebabnya eh, mereka memiliki fasilitas-fasilitas pemandian umum yang luar biasa eksklusifnya begitu. Kemudian ya tadi penggunaan saluran air itu nggak bisa terjadi kalau tanpa pembangunan jembatannya. Jadi mereka eh, membuat jembatan-jembatan yang bisa berfungsi untuk mengantarkan air juga. Ini salah satunya di Alcantara di atas sungai Tagus di Spanyol, dibangun 1106 Masehi. Aduh, kita masih jadi apa ya 106? Ini ada katanya di jembatan ini ada prasasanya nih. Saya telah membangun jembatan yang akan bertahan selamanya dan itu sampai sekarang masih akurat dibangun 106 Masehi. Sekarang udah 2023 Masehi ya. Nah, ini lagi nih yang ada di film-film itu yang tentang Beauty and the Beast kalau nggak salah. Jadi si cantik dan si buruk rupa tuh kalau kalian pernah nonton, nah ini kan si buruk rupa tuh keluar masuknya lewat saluran air. Nah saluran air ini saluran pembuangan air kota. Ya, air kota, jadi ya hujan dan sebagainya gitu ya, riol kota. meskipun kurang kurang di apa ya, kurang dipuji atau di apa, ini sangat penting dalam kehidupan perkotaan gitu, dibangun dari saluran air dan kanal terbuka yang digunakan. Ini namanya kloaka maksima, digunakan di seluruh Republik Kekaisaran. Eh, Beberapa bagian masih, kemudian eh, jadi kita bisa bisa mengetahui bagaimana infrastruktur yang begitu megah di zaman Roma. Tadi jembatan, saluran air bersih, saluran air kotor kota itu sudah terencana dengan matang, bahkan pemandian itu menjadi ritual yang nggak sekedar mandi. Tadi kan ditunjukin tuh denahnya ya, pakai diminyaki dulu lah ini sebelum akhirnya mereka mandi, ada air hangat, ada air dingin, dan ada perpustakaannya gitu loh. Jadi ritual mandi itu dilakukan oleh orang-orang yang anggapnya itu adalah apa ya, bersenang-senang gitu. Mungkin kalau kayak zaman sekarang renang ya. Nah, kemudian ini jalan. Ini jaringan jalan Roma. Ini yang diambil ini adalah salah satu contoh Appian Way, jalan beraspal besar yang pertama yang dibangun di pertengahan abad keempat sebelum Masehi. Ingat-ingat ya, sebelum Masehi loh nih. Jalan ini menghubungkan Roma dengan Brindisi, memiliki terowongan sepanjang 1 kilometer untuk menghubungkan pangkalan angkatan laut. Nah, ini yang nomor tadi, yang tadi itu bagian yang dari nomor 4 tadi, yang kaitannya dengan saluran-saluran dan jalan. Kemudian yang nomor 5 tadi karena dia sudah tidak bergantung pada, kalau Yunani kan pakai marmer karena dia menggunakan ya bahannya yang ada. Nah, sementara Roma bahannya sudah sangat beragam karena dia menguasai hampir sebagian besar belahan dunia di dalam kekuasaannya, sehingga dia mempunyai banyak pilihan. Nah, pilihannya dia itu justru pada beton, karena dengan beton dia bisa eh, dia bisa beton itu kan konsepnya mencampurkan bahan kering kemudian dengan bahan basah dan ada perekatnya kan, semen kan. Nah, dia udah mengenal itu bahan kering, entah debu vulkanik, entah batu, entah pasir, kemudian dengan bahan cair gitu ya. Terus diikat dengan semen. Nah, dia sudah menemukan itu, kemudian bahan kering itu akan mengeras dengan bahan cair tadi saat bahan cair itu mulai mengering. Nah, itu tadi itu adalah bahan revolusioner dia yang membuat dia daya tahan bangunannya sampai sekarang masih kita lihat. Saya ke Roma itu 8 tahun yang lalu. Jadi eh, video-video baru dan lama ini ya masih tetap seperti itulah gitu ya. Terus nah ini tadi sudah sedikit diceritakan di depan bahwa mereka sudah memikirkan fasilitas perumahan gitu ya untuk masyarakatnya. Terus tadi kan diceritain tuh ada kalau yang orang kaya, jadi rumahnya udah tipe 136 gitu kan. Satu tuh yang rumah mewah, 3 tuh menengah, terus yang 6 itu yang rakyat jelata yang apa, kecil-kecil dan berdempetan gitu.
Housing in ancient Rome brings to mind initially the villa, a large countryside residence. However, many Roman citizens lived in so-called insulae, urban apartment blocks which had up to 7 floors. Only the wealthiest Romans were able to afford a domus, a city mansion, and only the super rich owned a countryside villa. The home of an average citizen in the city of Rome could have looked like this. These blocks of houses the Romans called island, or insulae in Latin. On the ground floor there were stores, the so-called tabernae. On the upper floors there were cenacula, apartments. The roomiest and best furnished flats were on the first floor. They had multiple rooms, balconies, toilets, and in some cases even running water fed by aqueducts. The residents of the higher floors lived in smaller and poorer apartments, without private toilets, but they were cheaper. On the rooftops of insulae, there were sometimes even improvised wooden sheds. Due to poor building, bad structures and very little space in between the insulae, they had lots of issues. Fires could destroy entire districts. Water could get into the cheaply air-dried brick of the walls during a flooding. This made the insulae, which were fragile to begin with, even more unstable, and could even let them collapse. The apartments themselves were often in similar bad shape. Wind and rain came through the walls, which were full of cracks. Despite these obvious disadvantages, the major part of the urban citizens lived in such insulae. The main reason for this is that the rooms in insulae were rental accommodations. The insulae were originally introduced to handle the enormous and growing population of the city in relatively small and confined spaces. The historian Hannah Platz states that there were 40,000 insulae. In contrast, she estimates that there were fewer than 2,000 domus. These differ from insulae, according to Janet Delane, in that they were privately owned properties. Hence, they were not affordable for most people. But whoever was capable of affording something better than rooms in an insulae would for sure upgrade to a domus. Places of residence were relevant to social status and the self-representation of anyone participating in politics. Appropriate dwellings were simply must-haves when climbing the social and political ladder. Let's have a look at an example from the 1st century BC. Quintus Lucretius Ofella was a well-known general of equestrian rank. In the Roman civil wars, he served under the dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla and led his men at the siege of Praeneste. He seized the city and presented to Sulla the head of Marius, Sulla's antagonist. Because Ofella played a vital role in Sulla's victory, he gained a lot of money and a massive boost in prestige. Except for his success in battle and his death, we know very little about Ofella. But importantly, Plutarch informs us that he sought to move up in society and pursue a political career. Usually, a political career would have been only an option for Romans of higher birth, i.e. aristocrats with a senatorial ancestry. Although it was possible to advance in Rome without this, it was significantly harder. Those who still managed to do so were called homines novi, new men. The most famous example of a homo novus is Cicero. For Ofella to pursue politics, he would have needed to improve his social standing by quite a margin. Before Sulla's reforms, it would have been unlikely for Ofella to even get a chance. Like many men of equestrian rank, Ofella might have lived in a first-floor apartment of an insula. He would thus have needed a private residence, a domus of his own, to be on par with other aristocrats. But to buy or build a domus was no small enterprise. The domus, the house of the Roman elite, was constructed using costly materials such as marble. They were furnished with elaborate decorations, inlaid panels, intricate door jambs and sturdy columns. Both the walls and the floor were embellished with pompous paintings, fabulous frescoes and intricate mosaics. In the outside wall of the domus, facing the streets, were tabernae as well. On entering the domus, through the ostium, the entrance, one first stepped into the vestibulum, the entrance hall, sometimes also called fauces, which means something like open mouth or throat. Through this one passed to the atrium, the center of the domus. The atrium was a large central hall, with a statue or an altar to the household gods. It was surrounded by high-ceiling porticos. In the very center, there was an open square in the roof, the so-called compluvium, through which the rain fell into the impluvium, a basin on the ground. The atrium was the most important part of the domus, because it was the place where the guests and petitioners were greeted. Leading off the atrium was a dining room, the triclinium, a study room, the tablinium, bedrooms, the cubicula and the culina, the culinary kitchen where the slaves prepared meals. The tablinium connected the atrium to the peristylium, a small, roofless courtyard, around which the back part of the house was centered. From this part of the domus, one could enter the bathrooms and the kitchen. Somewhere in this part of the house, there was usually a posticum, an entrance for servants and family members who wanted to leave the house unseen. As a whole, the building was constructed on one axis, so that an entering guest could see through the vestibulum, the atrium and the tablinium to the peristylium. The domus was closed towards the streets, and the walls didn't bear any windows. This created a safe space, separating the living space from the outside, which was regarded as dangerous. Since the 1st century BC, the word domus does not only refer to a building but also to a whole household, including family members, servants and slaves. Now, about the time Ofella's domus would have been built, he heard that Sulla was looking for new candidates to fill the depleted senatorial benches. Because Ofella hadn't been contacted personally, he decided to run his own campaign for consulship. He even canvassed on the Forum Romanum, despite Sulla had told him not to. Eventually, he figured that he had to improve his architectural self-representation even further and to make his wealth a little more obvious to the public. So he looked for a nice spot on a hill outside the city, say near Tusculum, where he could have built a villa suburbana, a countryside residence. Besides the villa suburbana, there were several other types of villae. There was, for example, the villa rustica, which was basically an estate with functioning agricultural facilities and workshops. This agricultural flair was much less important in other types of villas, but it was a common feature even for primarily representative villas. Ofella would have wanted a place to spend his leisure time, otium, in which he would have perhaps engaged in literary or philosophical pursuits. What sets the villa apart from the domus and the insulae is not only their sheer size, but their placement in nature. Around the Gulf of Naples, in southern Italy, for example, the villae were placed in the mountains, around lakes or close to the sea. A villa was deemed perfect if it dominated the scenery and provided a vast panorama view. In addition, extensive lavish gardens surrounded the houses, and redirected streams gently flowed through the gardens. Ironically, while the poor tenants of urban insulae with cracked walls unwillingly suffered chilly winds, the houses of rich people were placed in windy locations on purpose to ensure fresh air circulation and to reduce bad smells. Indispensable to a villa were cryptae, multiple other porticos and a bath. Of course, the furniture and ornamentation depended on the budget of the owner. The range went from modest interiors, focused on an elitist educational landscape, to all the splendor one could think of. Vast mosaics, art collections, mural paintings, extensive libraries or expensive dishes. The villae are also famous for another very important feature, only affordable for the rich: heating. The Romans used so-called hypocausts. The word is derived from the Greek terms hypo, meaning under, and caust, meaning burnt. As shown here, the system of central heating provided warmth by heating the space beneath the ground through the smoke and heat of the furnace. Many rich Romans possessed more than one villa, spent the major part of the year there, and went to their domus in the city only to pursue their political activities. It was a villa in this style Ofella might have wanted to build. It would have certainly impressed his fellow Romans, but why did it not work out for him? Well, we know from Plutarch that Ofella, while gathering supporters for his election, went to the forum with a large crowd of followers. Sulla's patience with Ofella and his self-made political advances was wearing thin, very thin. He sent one of his centurions over to Ofella. In front of all the Romans on the forum, he simply had him slain.
Oh, kuliahnya berakhir hari ini. Kalau ada pertanyaan silahkan. Kalau nggak ada pertanyaan, kuliah saya akhiri. Minggu depan 4 pertemuan berikut adalah 4 topik, 4 pertemuan ya. Tapi kalau anak kelas B saya kan 2. Pokoknya 1 bulan berikut itu adalah Mesir. Dan kemudian karena Romawinya sudah selesai, silahkan poster dan presentasi serta pinningnya dikerjakan. Kemudian mulai di store ke bagian websitenya. Gitu. Ada yang mau ditanyakan? Oke, kalau nggak ada pertanyaan, kuliahnya saya akhiri. Assalamualaikum. Ya, ya. Silahkan, gimana?
Jadi membuat Romawi ya.
Kenapa?
Ketika ini membuat bangunan Romawi.
Bukan membuat ya, ya ya mengerjakan topik Romawi. Membuat Romawi kamu nggak membuat, ya membuat itu dalam arti membuat poster, membuat presentasi, kemudian menginputkan ke bagian apa namanya, diserahkan ke bagian poster untuk diinput gitu.
Terus selanjutnya keempat itu berarti Mesir.
Iya, Mesir ini nanti minggu besok 4 kali sesi topik adalah Mesir. Gitu?
Oke, Bu.
Ya. Oke, Assalamualaikum.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Ada lagi yang mau bertanya?